Welcome back. Episode 13 of the We Are Everywhere podcast. I always like having guests on that I've never met before. It's kind of the whole point of this podcast. I sprinkle in a few here and there of my own Phish crew, which are also fun. But this episode is someone that I've never met before. He reached out also, and if you want to reach out to be on a future episode, shoot me an email right here, sttf.weareeverywhere@gmail.com. Today's guest is an author, and he's for if you're watching this, obviously you're into Phish, and you've probably, if you're a reader, have read some of his stuff. Jamaica, Cornell 77, the music, the myth, the magnificence of the Grateful Dead. And he's actually got a new book coming out. It's on pre-order right now, Merch Table Blues. Ladies and gentlemen, Peter Connors. What's up, Peter? How was that intro for you, man? I left out some of your books. You more than that, but I didn't want to just like ramble on and on and on. I want to hear it from you. So you're an author, man, and you're writing about, music and counterculture. I always think that's such a funny term. But you're super into, obviously, the Dead, Phish. Tell us a little bit about one, how you became to be an author, and then two, about your new book that's coming out.
Yeah. So, I mean, I will say, like, I discovered a passion for writing when I was pretty young. I would say, like, 15, 16, right in there. I had sort of this epiphany at one point when I was looking at a book. I was assigned books in English class, just like everybody.
Sure.
But I had this epiphany at one point where I realized that a human being had actually created the words that were in that book,
Yeah.
Because to me, it was like books were just something that were handed to you by somebody, and you're like, oh, they must just appear in the world.
Yeah.
And it became, it was like, oh, wait, a person wrote that, had that thought, put that down, and then it became a book. And I think I can do that because I really like to read books and I like words. And so at that point, I just started to write. And I will say, like, I never was a successful student. I didn't do well in school.
Me either.
And around, almost simultaneously, when I sort of got into writing, I discovered the Grateful Dead. And this was, like 1985 or so.
Cool.
I started to get bootlegs from friends and so forth. And so to me, writing and music, and then, we say counterculture, the culture that goes with all of that, are sort of inextricably linked. I had no idea that, as an adult now, I would actually be writing and publishing books that, connected back to that. But the truth is, like, to me, there's a wellspring of American culture that comes from this scene, this community, the leaders of the counterculture. So, it's to me, this is all very much like American culture, not just counterculture. And so, yeah, so that's how I mean, that is sort of how music and writing were always really linked for me.
Yeah, no, it's cool, man. And it's something you said at the very beginning, whenever you were talking about discovering, like, that someone actually wrote those words that made up a book. I remember having that same thought process, like, at some point, and I never followed the path of becoming an author or writing. I'm not very good at it, but I also, whenever hearing you say that, I was like, holy shit. Like, I remember having that same thought. I was like, dude, a person wrote this, like, it's not crazy to think of, but like, once you make that connection, you're like, this is pretty cool, man. This came from someone's brain.
And I'm sure musicians, have that same thing, like at a certain point, and, it's probably some sort of brain maturation process. But if you're oriented towards a certain art form in particular, I think there is that moment where you go, like, I think I can do that, and it's not going to be like that one or like that one. And at that point you start gathering, influences, and as opposed to just seeing something and liking it, it becomes a part of your learning process too.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I'm excited to, because I've never read any of your work, but after like looking you up and like seeing some of the books that you've written, I was like, oh, this seems like I would be into like reading this. Like, this is something that would catch my attention. So I'm looking forward to reading some of your work. And you actually, we were talking a little bit before we started recording. I've got like a secret copy. It's not out yet, of your new your new book, Merch Table Blues. Tell us a little bit. Don't give too much away, but let's talk about that when it's coming out. I think it's on pre-sale right now.
Yeah.
What's it about? How'd you come to write it, and tell us all about it?
Yeah, so the books that you had mentioned before are all nonfiction books, so they're very much like research based, and except for Growing Up Dead, which is a memoir about going to Dead shows starting in the mid '80s, and so, but the others were like, a history of the Dead playing at Cornell 77. Jamaica was what we call an oral history of the jam band scene. So I did interviews with all the early folks, some who we'll talk about today, who got the jam band scene going. And that is like, so it's an early history of how the scene came about, the sort of wave after the Grateful Dead, let's say. This is my first novel. So I hadn't written, I've been doing just nonfiction. And I will tell you that I wrote the first draft of this book over 20 years ago.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And that's not to say I've been working on this book for 20 years. It always just seemed to me like there's something here. And the real basic premise behind it is like, what if a band who had a cult following, what if it was actually a cult? And it was kind of that simple. I was like, okay, like, first of all, obviously I know what this looks like to be following a band around and stuff. And, within any scene like that, there are different sort of clusters of people and on all this stuff. And I was really intrigued. And I've always been kind of intrigued by cults and cult leaders and how these things, come about. And so it combined a bunch of things that were interesting to me. And so this is novel. It's completely, fictional. It's a made up story. And the band is a band that's based out of Burlington, Vermont. And
how'd you come up with that?
I know, right? And so the band is based out of Burlington. They're starting to tour, clubs, and they're still in the early stages. But, like tapers have started to show up and things like this that were sort of the early signs that people were really paying attention to what was going on here. And so basically you have this band out of Burlington starting to tour up and down the East Coast primarily, and a group that's following them. And the group that's really following them is actually led by this cult leader. And, it's what I'd like to say is it's a fun, like, sex, drugs, rock and roll and murder book. And I imagine this and hope to see this like in the back seats of cars and vans of people on tour this summer, because it's that kind of book. It's like, it's a fun read. It really is. And I think if you're into the music scene, if you're into, just whatever, something that's going to grip you and be fun to read in between shows or whatever, like, get copies, pass them around. I want to see them like dog-eared, on the dashboards.
Oh, so you're pro dog-ear. I wouldn't.
Dog-eared. This book should be dog-eared and passed around. And it's I really, it's written, I will say, very much like it's written like for us and by somebody who lives this, you know what I mean? So it's like, I would love it to reach a general audience too. And I think a lot of different people could read it and dig it. But if you're into, this music, and if you're into this scene, like, it's going to speak to you. And I will say, like, there's little Easter eggs sprinkled throughout that, like, only people in the know are going to, like, even recognize, a particular name or a reference or whatever.
Okay, cool. Yeah. Like the main characters, like Brian and Robert.
Yeah. There's like, I think, so I won't give them away, but you'll find things in there. Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's cool, man. I'm excited. I'm excited to read it. So it's on pre-sale currently. When does it actually come out?
May 6th.
May 6th.
So it'll be, but it's great if people do pre-order it, because it is available now, and then you get it right away. And I'm excited. I'm really excited about it. Obviously, it's something that I've picked up and put down for 20 years. It's really cool for me to finally get it out into the world and get this idea that wouldn't sort of leave me alone,
Yeah.
Hopefully it will not leave anybody else alone now too.
Yeah. And we were talking a little bit before, you can actually pre-order it at bookshop.org. And then we were going to put the full link in, but it was like super long. So just go to bookshop.org and type in Merch Table Blues. It'll pop up, pre-order it. When it comes out, you can buy it. And are you going to hit any shows and like try to like sling these on lot, or are you just letting the
I
internet take
might.
care of it.
Yeah, I was talking to a buddy last night about that and seeing where he's going. And I don't have any specific plans yet, but I may very well do that. It's just I'm not positive yet.
Gotcha.
Um, But
And so
I also just want to mention that bookshop.org. It's a great place to buy books and things. I mean, you can buy the book on Amazon and stuff too. Bookshop.org actually supports independent bookstores, and money from each purchase goes to support, local indie bookstores. So that's why I like to sort of promote that.
yeah, instead of Amazon, which is, you
Yeah,
know, it's fine, but making
yeah,
the rich richer type thing. Yeah, bookshop.org, merch table blues. So knowing that you're also on the East Coast, you're in New York,
right.
and we were talking about hitting some shows and maybe doing that whole thing. Did you put in for any tickets on the lottery? Have you gotten any tickets? Are you seeing any shows this summer?
I haven't yet. I haven't done anything like about making any plans whatsoever.
Gotcha. Okay. Okay. It because
And
it's go
And
ahead.
I will tell you, like honestly, like I am 51 years old. I have 3 kids, and I have a full time job and all this stuff. So it is tough for me to sort of peel away and go to many. So
Sure.
I will catch what I can catch, like when I can catch it.
Hmm.
But my days of being able to like go and hit multiple shows are, let's say I'm between them. Maybe they'll come back, but
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, but you actually sent me a picture of some old stubs that you found,
yeah,
and I think the dates on those were like 91. So you've put in your fair share of
yeah,
going and like seeing the band. So is that when your first show was in 91, or when did you start? When and
yeah.
where did you dive into Fish?
Right. And I will tell you, like I am much more connected to, I will go and see Phish anytime I can when they come around and when they're within striking distance. So my first Phish show was at Potsdam College in 1991. It
Okay.
was on Earth Day. And I guess the student, the student activities committee paid for it. So it was free for us to just go in. And we
Wow.
had already had I guess we would have had Lawn Boy by then. So Potsdam
Mhm.
is pretty close to Burlington. It's way up north.
Okay.
So we were getting, tapes, and we got the early recordings and stuff. And we were, the people that I was with were from the Grateful Dead scene. And immediately, like, Phish stood out to us. And I had friends who were musicians too, who appreciated the sort of jazz elements that they were also bringing into this too, in a way that I didn't understand at that point. I heard the jams more, and I heard at that point I was pretty intrigued by a bunch of the lyrics too. Being a writer, I was kind of fascinated by certainly like the song cycles and stuff like that. And I remember I had an early copy of Trey's thesis that I listened to over and over. I had got a surgery, and I was recovering. It took weeks and weeks of recovery, and I had that tape, and I just listened to it over and over. And I loved like Dark Side of the Moon, and I loved, albums that sort of like told this whole story, within
Sure.
it.
Yeah.
So I thought I was really fascinated by the fact that this like new band, this young band, had these amazing chops. They were bringing in elements of everything from Frank Zappa to like traditional jazz and barbershop quartet, and
Yeah.
and they were jamming. They were like just fucking melting faces too. It was like
Ripping.
ripping it. Yeah.
Yeah.
So when they came, so the reason that they came to Potsdam is because my friends were all in control of the money that were spent on. So we were like, fuck, let's get Phish up. So Phish came, and we would all, what would we, like, I carried in we were carrying in their equipment with them.
Oh wow, that's cool.
And I remember getting into the truck, and the only things left were the trampolines and the vacuum. And Fishman was in there, and I said, do you need this? It was a vacuum. I was like, he goes, yeah, I play it. I was like, okay. And then like went back and came back, and there was these trampolines. Like, do you need these trampolines? Like, yeah, we use those too. I was like, right on, man. I have no idea what's about to happen, but cool, And lo and behold, they ripped the there's a Fishman vacuum solo in there, and the trampolines came out, and Trey's dog was walking around. I mean, it was very like, it was very sort of homey. And so from that point on, I went and saw them, wherever I could. The venues that I talk about in Merch Table Blues were the venues that I was really seeing Phish in at that time.
Oh, cool.
So
Okay.
they would play, when they played, let's say, for example, Rochester, where I'm at, it was a place called the Horizontal Boogie Bar at that time. And it was literally just a bar, and it wasn't sold out or anything. I mean, you just walk around, it was really, it was very, so I was in a fortunate position, I think, to understand what the band was doing like early on, to see that, and to also be sort of transitioning a little bit away from, or looking for the next thing besides the Grateful Dead.
Yeah.
Like I'm doing now with people who are into Phish. When I was into the Grateful Dead, I was like, you should have seen him back in, so-and-so. And I was like, well, Jesus, I just wasn't born yet. I mean, it wasn't my fault, man.
Yeah.
And now I'm doing it with Phish to other people. But we, the people who, it's not a reach to say the people who were at those early shows were Deadheads who found Phish. And at that time, they were also dialed in with, Blues Traveler and Aquarium Rescue Unit. You had Colonel Bruce Hampton out there, I found an old Colonel Bruce ticket stub.
R.I.P.
I was looking at, let's see if I can, an old Colonel Bruce ticket stub.
Oh, wow, dude.
That's at
94. Is that
the
say
Fox
94?
Theater in Boulder in 94. So, and this is why I wrote to America. It really was important to me and to us, the way that these bands emerged at the time that they did, because there was a sort of a vacuum a little bit between, what the Dead were doing, which at that point was, these huge stadiums and things like that. And somebody coming along doing something that was really fresh, but that also like tapped into that, tapped into that sort of sensibility. And, the fact that David Graham, Bill Graham's son, was managing a bunch of these bands at the time, was really, there was a lineage there that was clearly, in place. So David Graham ran Arrowhead Ranch, which we're going to talk about. And so, there was a real, there was a community there that was clearly attached. And, John Popper would play, sat in with, I don't know if it was the Dead or just with Jerry, but, there was some handoffs going on there. And even the Spin Doctors, the Radiators, and, there's a whole bunch of bands. And then there were smaller level bands too, that were, nobody's heard of them anymore, but they were out there playing, and they were sort of in these similar veins too. So to me, it was a really exciting time, because all of a sudden up somewhere and get a ticket and go in and see really great music, as opposed to having to plan it and go to a stadium and get the hotel rooms and all this stuff. And I will say, especially in the early, those 91, 92, 93, I ended up seeing Phish all over the place. And I remember specifically, they were playing at is it Clarkson University? Okay, so it was, again, right up near Potsdam, where I was, way up in the North Country. And it was just roped off to backstage, literally just a piece of rope, and I almost think that the stage was a flatbed truck for some reason. They pulled it up, and
it might have been.
It was very, it was very just thrown together. But I remember, so my friends and I were total freaks. We were wearing a top hat, I had dreadlocks, and we were all fully on hippied out. And
you had dreadlocks?
Yeah.
It's awesome.
And I remember seeing, Trey looking out at us and smiling. And I think there was this knowledge, you could see him connecting with us, connecting with them. And it was kind of yeah, this is on, this is on this. And, people, so it was a very, I feel really fortunate to have caught, that early wave. And like I say, I really, my life has gotten to a place where I can't do all the tours and all the shows and things that I can, but and also, sorry, my battery's about to run out of my stupid computer.
No, you're good.
Okay. Okay. And I've also spent a lot more time just focusing on my own art an
Yeah.
artistic career and taking all those experiences. But, you know, again, I feel really fortunate to have sort of been there and seen that, and now to be able to write about it some, because that's, you know, this is still, obviously it's still going on. And, you know, a bunch of people have been talking about, like, Goose just played a couple nights ago with Billy Strings, I guess. And, you know, there's just, I mean, it just keeps going now.
Yeah, it's funny that you brought that up, because one of the questions I was going to ask you, after hearing you talk about it, you know, with the correlation you were tying in with, like, the Dead, and, like,
Mhm.
in the early days, the people that found Phish were more, you know, that's how they found them. There were Deadheads that found this new band that was fresh.
Yeah.
So now fast forwarding to today, and Phish has kind of taken on that role. You know, they're massive, they're huge. What are some other bands? I know you just mentioned Goose and Billy Strings. Any other bands that you kind of feel like have that same early Phish energy that could possibly be the next big jam band go-tos?
I like Pigeons Playing Ping Pong. I
Okay.
think that they have that really fun, you know, Fish had that really fun, playful energy, and it
Yeah.
was goofy. And I see that sort of same goofy energy, and also like amazing chops with them. I do think Goose is great. You know, there's a bunch going on, and I, you know, I don't know how, you know, if those bands are so established now that they're considered to be, you know, at that
Top
level
tier.
or what.
Sure.
Yeah. Um, but anyway, you know, and I'm always psyched to just sort of see what's new and coming out too, you know, and to hear the connections. Like, I do think, like, I first came upon Billy Strings through him playing with Bill Kreutzmann,
Hmm.
and now I'm like, okay, this guy is like phenomenal, you know. And I had never heard of him before, but I heard about him through that connection. So, you know, being tapped into that scene keeps bearing fruit. And I
Yeah.
think it's always cool to see those sort of handoffs, you know, between different generations too.
Yeah. Yeah. Very cool. One band that pops to mind, you may have heard of them, the Jaunty.
I don't know them. Mm-mm.
Um, they're worth they're definitely worth checking out. I actually know the drummer from a Phish, you know, board message board
Mhm.
that we're both on, and watching their progression and, like, watching them grow, I feel like they're headed in that direction of being one of the next, you know, bigger top tier jam bands. They just got they're playing a show. They're doing Peach Festival.
Okay.
Yeah, so they're pretty good. So if you want to check them out, they're
Yeah, for sure.
on point. Um, Taking it back to Phish, knowing that you've been seeing them since the early days, which I think is so cool, dude. You were a on your first show, you were kind of a roadie for Phish. Like, you were helping them load in their gear and stuff.
Yeah. I mean,
Not
and
many.
I'll say, like, that happened more than once. There was nobody else to do it. You know what I
Yeah,
mean? So it wasn't, and there was just no, you know, there was just no distinction. I will say, like, there was very little distinction between who the band was and who the fans were at that point, because everybody was just sort of like, I guess
yeah,
we're all here, you know what I mean? Except for, like, when they played, it was phenomenal.
yeah.
But
I think that's so cool, though.
yeah,
Do you know at this point how many shows you've seen?
you know, I knew you were going to ask that, and you know, I've consistently seen them since 1991. Um, and I'm sure there were years that I didn't, but it's like it adds up. So I don't know.
Gotcha.
And I will tell you, like, I'm not like one of those memory people that can just go back and, like, recall things either. I sort of,
Sure.
like, used that up in the 80s. Um, but you know, I wouldn't be surprised to know it was like 40, 50, somewhere in there. But I've been to festivals. I'd been to Fish festivals that I forgot that I'd gone to. I think, yeah, you know, it was like something in Maine at one point. Like, honestly, like, I tell you, I saved some ticket stubs, and I started going through ticket stubs of old Fish shows, and I found one from Lincoln, Nebraska in 1995, right?
Oh, cool.
Um, and I was like, why the fuck did I go to Lincoln, Nebraska in 1995 to see Fish? And then I remembered I was living in Boulder at the time, And, you know, again, my friend was like, hey, do you want to just go to Nebraska and go see Phish? They're playing there. I was like, Phish is playing in Nebraska? That's crazy. Yeah, let's do it. So we just dosed and drove, you know, all night, just drove to the show and literally like went to the show and then drove back.
Wow.
And I will tell you, like, I don't think, to my knowledge, they've never played in Lincoln, Nebraska again. And I
Hmm.
think they might have even done some sort of release of this show. But again, it was such a, you know, it was like, it was a very like family vibe because it was such a random place to be. And so I will tell you, like, there's a whole bunch of stuff in my life like that that it got tucked away that I have the ticket stub, so I know I was there. Now I remember it, but like, you know,
Dude, I'm with you. I mean, it wasn't the early days like that, but even now, just trying to recall, because I've only been seeing Phish in 3.0, and just even
uh-huh.
trying to recall, like, you know, talking with friends, like, hey, were you at this show? And I'm like,
Yeah.
no. And then I, like you said, I'll like go through like my ticket stubs. I'm like, oh, I guess I was. And like
Yeah.
just trying to it all blends in, man.
Yeah, I
It's
found one from Riverport Amphitheater in 1995, and I'm like, where the hell is that? And it's in Missouri.
how'd I get there?
So
That's that part of
that was
the
clearly there.
counterculture.
Here it is. Don't
That's
ask me.
awesome, man.
Anyway,
Um,
so yeah, so it was, you know, they have been, I will say, and so my first time seeing them 91, so I was only 21 years old at that time. So they've really, you know, I will say like that was the beginning of my adulthood, and they've just sort of been a part of the fabric of that. And I
yeah.
never, you know, was obsessive about them to like the point of chronicling things, and you know, honestly, in some way, even really paying much attention.
Hmm.
In some ways, I've probably taken for granted that they've just always been there, and I've kind of just grown. You know, they're not much older than me, so I've just kind of grown up with them. But they're just a, you know, they're sort of one of those touchstone things. You know, it's almost like an object at this point, even a fish.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's funny that you say that because, you know, there's so many different types of fans. Like
Mhm.
fans that, like you mentioned, like chronicle everything. They have handwritten set lists for every show they've been to, kept every ticket stub. And
Yeah.
then, you know, you also have fans that are there to do drugs and party, and there's like, hey, that's a cool band playing, like I like the culture. And then, you know, you have, you know, just a normal fan. It's like like what you said, it's just like they've been apart, I've been there since the beginning, and you know, I love the music, but
Yeah.
you know,
Well, you know,
I guess I was at this show.
I will say the jam band scene, and this is something that probably hasn't been talked about that much or uncovered that much. I think it has been a really friendly place for people on the spectrum,
Oh,
because there's a certain obsessiveness to chronicling these things, to keeping track of all these things that really like lines up well
yeah,
with certain kinds of, you know, autism. And I think, you know, I'm not saying that that's where that all comes from, but I do think it's been, I think there's a lot of people on the spectrum who probably like led the charge on that. And then you have people, you know, I guess like me, who I've always considered myself more like impressionistic. So it's less important to me like the when and the where than like the flashes of like the memory, or, you know, the energy of it, or being able to recall that, which I find really useful for writing, especially because I can always research and look stuff up. But to
yeah.
be able to create a scene, you need to have like those sort of memories that are more evocative than factual, you know?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Especially like with the internet. I mean, you can look up anything about any show, set
Right.
lists, step outs, everything. Yeah, I'm with you. It's the and that's really at the core, you know, what it's all about. You know, that's why we go to these shows. People say, well, why have you seen Phish, you know, 50 times, 100 times, 200 times? It's
Right.
because you're gonna get something different and new each time. You know, it
Yeah.
could be a standard show. It could be the best show of all time. And that's kind of like what ties it in, and the memories, and like going with your friends, and like the road trip and getting there. It's the story behind it.
Absolutely. And you know, you do it long enough, and again, that becomes just a part of the story of your life. You know what I
Yep.
mean? So you go like, oh, where was I at that time? Oh, okay. I guess that's who I went with, and that's why I went with them, and this is what we did. And you know, and I think the beauty of it is like we always have the music. The music is available, you know, every show is available to us at the drop of a hat now, you know.
Yep.
And when, you know, honestly, like with some of the first Phish that I got was filler at the end of Grateful Dead bootleg tapes, cassettes.
Oh,
And then, but like all the early, you know, bootlegs that we had of Phish were just cassettes.
sure.
And then Trey's thesis was obviously a cassette. You could hear him like breathing, like, you know, into it and all this stuff.
That's funny.
But you know, so it was harder to access the music in some ways, but you probably listened to the individual shows more and more. I mean, now you can pull up anything and listen to whatever anytime. And
Yep.
so that's, you know, that's really special too. I mean, it's just it is the fact that that can happen, you know, it's an alternative you just take for granted, but trust me, like it's fucking amazing that you can do that.
Yeah, no.
We spent a lot of time trying to track down decent recordings of different bands. Like the fact that you can do that is really cool. Like don't take it for granted.
Yeah, and it's one of those things like just from like my age and not being born, you know, or old enough to go during the early days. Everything from the time that I've been into Phish has been accessible like that. You know, you're not having to like meet other fans and like get cassettes or CDs. You know, it's just you get on your computer and type in Phish and start listening. You know, so
or, you know, for that matter, like watching, you know, or whatever. I mean, it's really, it's very cool. Yeah,
it's very cool. One thing that I'm kind of curious of, because you have been seeing Phish for so long, is through all of the shows, do you have like a favorite song or a song that you've been chasing that you haven't seen them play yet? That you can remember?
yeah, I know. Like as we just said, like I don't. I don't. I will say, you know, as sort of old, you know, as an old whatever, as a 1.0 guy,
Yeah.
I always like going to shows and hearing like you know, the songs from back in the day because I get that kick of nostalgia. But I really like you know, a bunch of the new stuff too. But there isn't anything in particular that I would go like, you know, like, oh, they finally played that. I just
Gotcha. Okay.
it sort of all just washes over me, you know.
Yeah. Another thing that I like to kind of like see what people's different answers are is if you were you met someone that had never heard of Phish, like let's say you meet someone and you're, you know, selling your book. They're like,
Yeah.
oh, Phish, I never heard of Phish, or, you know, like Grateful Dead or anything like that. Do you have a song or a show that comes to mind that you would play for that person to try and convert them or be like, hey, this is why Phish is so great?
Yeah. You know, I think that's a really good question. And I always think of like, you kind of got to match the album. Let's say, let's like keep it to albums. Like you kind of got to match the album to the person's personality.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So I've always liked, like Billy Breeze, I think is a really accessible album and it's got some like just really lovely songs and it's not super, you know, it's not too weird to give to people where they're like, I don't even know what I'm listening to.
Sure. Yeah.
So, you know, that might be one that would be sort of like here, you know, here's something easy. But I mean, at this point, there's just there's so much to listen to.
Yep.
I don't know. I have a funny thing about that where I'm always like, you know, if you don't, you sort of either get it or you don't. I have a hard time thinking like you can convert somebody to liking this type of stuff because it's like you're either oriented toward it or you're like, this is giving me a headache, you know,
or anxiety.
And, you know, I understand both perspectives. I respect both perspectives. You know, it's far be it from me to press what I like on anybody else.
Right.
But I think, you know, if you're into this stuff, like you'll find it, like, you'll find it eventually.
Yeah. And it's like, I forget where I saw this or who the actual saying came from, but it was referring to the Dead, and it was something along the lines of, you know, the Dead is like licorice. It's not, licorice isn't for everyone, but the people that like licorice really like licorice.
Yeah. That was actually Jerry Garcia who said that.
Jerry said that.
Yeah, no, it's a great quote. Yeah.
Yeah, it is. On the flip side of, you know, talking about favorite songs or songs that you would play for, you know, people to get them into Phish, do you have any songs from Phish that you would be okay with never hearing again?
That's a funny question. No, I don't think so.
No, they all do it for you.
Yeah, I mean, here's my thing. Like, if it's getting them off, if they're playing it, it must be getting them off somehow. So, like,
Yeah.
who am I to say, like, don't get yourself off on what you do? What do I care? I mean, there's always a time to go take a piss. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? So, like,
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. Like, what's the piss break song, you
right?
know?
Yeah. So no, but again, it kind of in the same way. There's nothing I'm chasing. There's also nothing I'm like running away from.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
I think, a band like Phish too is, I mean, the real, the kicker is that you could take something that you don't like and all of a sudden something happens within it that you don't want to miss.
yeah,
And that's what keeps us all coming back. It's not so pat that you're like, okay, here's these, 4.5 minutes that, I'll never get back. And I wish I didn't have to like live through. It's like, no, that 4.5 minutes just turned into like 15 minutes that I didn't see coming and transitioned into something else in the middle. And then, so,
yeah.
this is why we go. Cause you never quite know what the turn's going to be.
Never know what's gonna happen. Um, and so now that you know, you spent your early days, like getting hooked on Phish, and now you're at a different, point in your life. You're, you said you got kids and you got your career and everything. You can't see them as much. Um, what are some of those stories? And we kind of talked about some earlier in the episode, but like, what are those stories that like stick out? That um, from those times like where you wound up in Nebraska and you're like, oh yeah, no, I was there. Do you have any stories or memories that pop in your head to where you're like, oh, that was a really cool time with Phish, or like road tripping to see Phish, or like my buddies?
Yeah, you know what stood out to me, and again, I was going through, and I had to. So I went and saw them play on New Year's Eve in 1991 in Worcester,
Oh, cool.
um, and I do remember walking up into the show, and I don't know if people are going to know this reference, but there's a big red school bus, and you see it on tour different places, and the people who own it and run it are called Yoshuas,
Okay.
and they were always big in the dead scene, and they was pretty, I mean, they were apropos tying back into my book, they really were a cult. I mean, they are a cult.
Okay.
And so that was the first show that I saw the Joshua bus at a Phish show. And again, it was almost like making eye contact with Trey, and Clarkson. It was like, oh, okay, like these people are catching on. Like if they're catching on, then that means this is a good place to recruit. And so this is the next scene that they're going to be tied into. And it's a
So
funny, like strange reference, but when it comes back to me writing a book about a novel about a cult following a band, like that's in there for me, and it was an
yeah,
indicator of like this scene is really coming along in that way, and I will say, like, not in a positive way. I think it's, I'm not down with them, and there's a whole bunch of stuff you can read about them, and it is a cult.
you're like,
But
just disclaimer, I'm not with the Yasha.
yeah, but they've also been a fixture in the jam band scene community for decades now, so yeah, in that way I'm like, okay, some smart, cult leader among them like realized this is a new recruiting ground for
Yeah,
us.
weird. And I've never heard of the Yashuas. What were they? Because you said that they were like in the culture with the dead and stuff like that too. What would they do? Like,
Well, yeah, and I'm sure they've still, I bet you they're at Phish shows. They hand out literature, so you'll get like, they still, I've seen this at Phish shows, not that long ago, and in fact I got into a big argument. I used to like really confront them because they really pissed me off, because I felt like, they really preyed on kids in the scene who were a bit lost and who were probably disconnected from their families,
sure.
maybe a little strung out, looking for, some safety, some connection. And these are the places where cults, thrive. I mean, that is the sort of recruiting ground.
Right.
And in a lot of ways, like shows like this are perfect places to find that. You get kids who've run away, you've got kids who are on tour, and whatever.
Yeah.
And so the appeal is, come with us and you'll be part of our family, and we're all about love. And there is like a religious overtone to it, that sort of a mishmash of like even Christianity and then different like aspects of, different religions, but
Yeah.
it's nothing really coherent. But the bottom line is, once you're in it, it's just like any cult. So like your money's going there. So yeah, like if they're, you might see them now that I've pointed it out
Okay.
because they're still
Yeah.
in them.
Yeah. And maybe I have already and just haven't noticed, and just thought it was, some
It's
heads
just
like
a
trying to.
cool bus. I mean, this is the thing. Like, it's a really rad bus. It's like you just see it, and it's completely like decked out, and you want to go inside, and they want you to go inside, and they'll
Oh,
offer you to come inside, and they'll give you like tea and cookies or whatever, and they're usually like dancing around out front in a circle. But they were something that really stuck in my mind working on Merch Table Blues,
mm-hmm.
as what is the line between fandom, obsessive fandom, and just straight up like cult. And then in my mind, like, cult doesn't necessarily even have to be a negative thing. There are cults that I would say, like, okay, so I mean, are Christian as a cult? Like, I guess they're a cult, they're a religion, they're whatever, but I don't have any issues with them. You know what I mean? Like, I think
Sure.
they're cool.
Like, is any religion a cult?
Yeah,
What makes it a
every
cult?
exactly, is any religion a cult? Is Christianity a cult? Like, full on, you know what I mean? It's all cults at some level. Um, and but when I'm using the word cult, I'm sort of using it in the more like traditional, like almost like Charles Manson-y type,
Yeah.
sense,
Yeah.
David Koresh type sense. And so that's their sort of tip, they're on that wavelength.
Yeah. That's weird, man. I'm gonna be on the lookout, and I'm like trying to like remember, like, did I ever see a big red bus? Like,
Yeah,
was I on a big red bus?
maybe.
Yeah, that was it.
The
What
point is,
happened?
you made it off.
Yeah. Or
So,
did I?
it's one thing to get on the bus, it's the other to get off of it.
Yeah, exactly. No, that's cool, man. And the more that you're talking about this and like tying it back into your book, I'm really excited to dive in and read it, because it's one of those things, and maybe it was just like willful ignorance on my level. I never really thought that there was anything wrong with the scene.
Mm,
And I mean, other than like the blatant like drug use and things like that
yeah,
that can be harmful. But even listening to the Blackberry Jams podcast, talking about like the racism that can be, because the Phish fan base is predominantly white. I don't think anybody will argue that. And then listening to some of their episodes on like what they deal with, or people that aren't white deal with in the culture. It's pretty crazy. And like you have that, and you have the cult things that are popping in, the
yeah.
excessive drug use.
And in the middle of that, you have like, feds, posing as custodies and stuff like this. It's like, and that was a part of particularly the later, part of the dead scene too, is when you really started to see major busts happening and a lot of undercover activity, and police departments just getting like thrilled when they knew that the band was coming in town, and it became so predatory.
Yeah.
And I know that this has happened with the Phish scene too, and police departments being able to reach quotas on arrests and different things like that. And when you have things thrown in there, then like mandatory minimums, and you have these sort of draconian drug laws, some of which have been loosened at different places, but it was a lot of people did a lot of time for things that they in my mind they shouldn't have. And I think that it's smart for people to you want to enjoy and you want to love everything that's going on in the scene, and we're there for the music, but it's wise to go in with your eyes open and to be aware of all these other things too, because especially if you're going on tour or you're doing the road thing, that's it's a good way to learn about life and the world, and you got to be careful out there too.
Yeah, 100%. And I think like as I'm getting older, because I started, my first show, I was 19, 20. It's all rainbows and butterflies and Phish, and we're partying. And now as I'm a little bit older, going to shows, it's like, okay, wallet's in my front pocket, I see something going on over. It's just being
Yeah.
observant. Yeah. So if
One of
you're
the things that was what was interesting, and I guess maybe this is related to your original question, but with the Grateful Dead scene, by the time I got in the mid '80s, there was, you had old heads who had been around literally since the 60s or 70s or whatever. And there was a handing down of knowledge and wisdom and how to survive on the road and sort of like rules of the road that you live by. And they would enforce these, like you would get shit for doing the wrong type of stuff. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And that was part of the indoctrination of learning how to do that. And when we started going to Phish shows, and when I say we, I mean like all of the hippies who started to follow Phish when anybody was first following Phish, some of us took that stuff in, but there wasn't that level of like, these people have been around forever. And so now we're going to tell you how to live in the scene. So I think a bunch of us brought that in early on, but I don't know that that was an equal sort of translation into the Phish scene so much.
Yeah.
I'm sure it's developed that way because they've been around for long enough now, but early on it was a little, it was that sort of those bits of wisdom were coming from the Dead scene about how to tour and how to live. And, Phish didn't have to worry at that time about being kicked out of, we can't play this venue anymore because there were too many busts, or, they don't want us back in the town or whatever it might be. They weren't having those issues, but the Dead were.
Yeah.
And so you also had to learn how to make sure like the band could come back because you wanted to keep being able to camp and vend and all this stuff,
Yeah. Yeah. And it's crazy, man, because, with anything that's like, that starts off good like that, like with the Dead and then with Phish, as it grows, just by the laws of nature, as it grows, you're going to get bad parts in there. And it's all of our responsibilities, like kind of like what you were saying, like the rules of the road, and it all, this almost sounds like a cult speech, but like as a Phish fan and like, as like people that love this music, like we have to set an example, like we have to follow the rules per se to make sure, one, that the band can come back, and two, that we're all staying safe, and that three, we're not just like ruining something that's beautiful. You know?
No band wants to be, set up as essentially bait for busts.
Yeah.
And, unfortunately, like when a band hits the level of Phish and they have the sort of following that Phish does, like it's inevitable, that is just the way it happens. And again, I'm sure the band doesn't want to see that, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
They don't want to be in that role. But so for the book itself, you basically know right away that there are like straight up murders going on around this scene and all that stuff. And you basically meet, whether it's a band member, whether it's somebody who's in this cult or whatever, like you can't rule anybody out as the person who's really a ringleader of that until the end. So as much as I'm saying it's, a cult thing too, it actually involves the band in really like specific ways too, that they are much more involved than you might think when you start reading the book. Ooh. This is where this spins off. Phish was an influence on, the basic concept.
Yeah.
Obviously, then I took it in this other fictional direction. So I'm not. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, that's just the reality is, once you're out there on the road, you just got to keep your eyes open. It's just the world, and it's a great way to learn about the world.
Yeah, it is. Got to stay safe. Dude, you know what you should do whenever the book is like done and everything? Shoot a copy to Trey or the band or their manager or something, and just be like, hey, saw you guys in the early days, we had a connection. You looked at me. I had dreadlocks. Just ship them the book, man. And because I mean, how cool would that be if they read it and like post about it or something?
Yeah, that'd be really cool. I was at there was these concerts called Move Me Brightly that were Bob Weir's TRI Studios, and for Jerry Garcia's birthday. Gosh, I don't know how long ago. Maybe it was 10 years ago now. But anyway, Mike played bass for it.
Okay, cool.
And I was there for all the rehearsals and things like that. So I was just, I got to just hang out there with everybody for a few days before anything happened. And I actually had a really nice lunch with Mike and got to just sort of like reminisce about, these old days or whatever like that. And I think he enjoyed, I think hearing that too, hearing that sort of like older connection as well. And, I mean, I remember seeing Fishman with like Pork Tornado back in the day, and just like, again, like, at a certain point, if you're old enough and you sort of like these, they're just folks, right?
Yeah.
But certainly, gosh, if they talked about the book, that would be really good for the book, because a lot of
Yeah.
people are listening.
Yeah, exactly. Man, once again, I'm excited to read Merch Table Blues, and actually dive into some of your other work too, because I didn't know about it. And like the Cornell 77, like that's the greatest show of all time. So like hearing like your take in on that and like seeing how you present it, I'm excited to dive in and get familiar with some of your work. Was the Cornell 77 that was in the box set?
Yeah, so you're right. So Rhino released that Cornell 77 box set that had like 4 other shows with it. And it actually was released simultaneously with my book. So the book is in the first 15,000 copies of the box set, all contain my book in it too.
Wicked. Okay,
Yeah.
cool.
And that was orchestrated with Rhino and with the publisher, and sort of coordinated in that way.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, man. I'm excited. Once again, the book comes out. The release date is when?
It's like April, May, like May 6th, but you can
May 6th.
pre-order it now. What I always tell people is like, order it now and you'll get the first copy as soon as it ships. Like, it'll be at your doorstep. So,
yep. Once again, bookshop.org. Just search Merch Table Blues. Some of those proceeds will go back into local bookstores instead of a billionaire's pocket. And man, before we wrap up, any other like cool stories that are popping in your mind from the road, or just anything else you want to share about your book or life or yourself or anything?
I will tell you, like, one thing that was cool, and I think I sent you a picture of these too. So these are tickets to Arrowhead Ranch. That was a really special place. And these were from July 20th and 21st, 1991. I think maybe they had done Amy's Farm before that, but it was really like this first sort of like proper festival, I'd say. But it was like, again, just roped off, and there's just a handful of people there. You can actually see the whole show on YouTube. I watched it last night.
Okay, cool.
So I think what I would say is, like, if anybody wants to sort of go back in time and see sort of the time that I'm talking about, go look at that. And it's really, there's something very, the word that I kept thinking about as I was watching it too, is it's very like human. Like, the sound system isn't crazy. They're just using whatever PA, is available at that time. The music is all phenomenal, but it's very like accessible in this way of like, this is just a band on a stage. There's not that transcendence into some complete other world. Like, they're on a completely different level now,
Yeah.
And it's amazing, and I love it. But this was a really earthy sort of experience. The other thing you'll notice right away, or it's worth checking out, is that everybody's watching listening to the music and watching the band, and nobody's looking at their phone or holding it up. And it was funny because I was watching with a friend who was there with me. We were watching it last night to sort of, prepare for this talk and stuff. And he pointed it out, and I hadn't even thought about it. And I went, you're right, man. Look at that. Like, everybody's just watching and everybody's talking to each other. So I hate to be the old guy who's going to say this to you.
Say it.
But put your phone down. Listen to the music, dance. You're only there for a short time, and you'll remember it. Trust me, you'll remember it. You don't have to see the pictures. You don't have to share it with anybody else. That's your memory. So live it, remember it, enjoy it. And
100%.
You will always have the music.
Yeah, 100%. I couldn't agree more. And I will say there have been a few shows to where like I'll look around, because I like to do exactly what you said. I'm there for Phish. I'm there for the music. But like if I come back, from set break or something, they just start up. Like as soon as they're walking out, I'll be like, quick picture.
Right.
I'm like, I'm not that guy. I'm not that guy.
But we've all like been behind the person who's like holding up the phone because they're filming the whole thing, or they're like, they've got their friend on FaceTime. You're like, and I hate it, but like my eyes go to that screen instead.
Yeah.
And then I'm like, I don't want to be looking at that screen, or put it down. And so, but now I'm just the grumpy old man telling kids to get off the lawn. So
no, you know what I did? You know what I did at one show? I'm not proud of this, but it's something that I did do. There was someone in front of me, and they had their friend on FaceTime,
Yeah.
and they were holding it up, and I just snuck up behind them and like touched their screen and hung up, and they whipped around and they were like, "Why would you do that?" And I was like, "Watch."
Right.
But it was one of those things where like in the moment I was like,
'Cause
"Oh, this is so awesome," and then like afterwards I was like, "Damn, that was kind of a dick move."
Whatever.
But dude, Peter, thank you so much for taking the time and reaching out and being on the podcast. Can't wait to read your book. Everyone else, once again, bookshop.org, merch table blues. And man, hopefully I'll see you at a show. I know you
I
don't
hope
have any
so.
concrete, summer tour plans, but if you wind up getting some tickets,
Yeah.
let me know, and we'll link up at some point, man.
Right on. Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I appreciate it, man.
All right. Take care.